I think we talk a lot about how to get things done. I think I'm going to talk about how to get things right. And before I start, I have a quick question. Cockpits, hospitals, and Formula 1. What do they all have in common? Because I think it's just the situation that can present itself. You cannot predict what will happen. And therefore, it's extremely complex as an environment. And like all of you said, there is a high cost of failure. There is another very interesting thing that is common in all these three and heavily used, and that is a checklist. Does it surprise any of us कि यार इन तीनों situations में, इन तीनों industries में, इन तीनों contexts में, there is one thing that is heavily used, which is a checklist. And I figured out that it's probably one of the easier things to do for people to understand and also for us to create for people to understand and implement. And that is probably what is interesting in all these three industries. They heavily use checklists, or how they came about to be used in these three industries, right? Let me get talking about the Formula 1, the pit crews, right? When the Formula 1 driver comes into a pit, there is a checklist. He hardly has time. They hardly have time. It's teamwork, it's complex, it's fast, and it can be fatal. And they hardly have time. Those 10 or 12 people that buzz around the driver, they have, I think, all together, 10 seconds to do what they have to do. And they have a checklist, right? Without which it's not about not getting done. It's not getting done right? And that's what checklists solve. There are two other very interesting case studies of checklists in cockpits and hospitals, and I want to talk about that. They're extremely interesting. One is in, I don't know how many of us know that. I didn't know this before I started reading this. So on October 30th, 1985, Boeing had developed a massive bomber airplane. Right? It carried 5 times the load. It was an extremely complex piece of machinery. And it took off from Dayton, Ohio. And it crashed. It was a new model. और जब crash की investigation हुई तो पता लगा the only reason that was cited or was understood was that it was a pilot error. Right? The machine per se didn't have any issues. It was a pilot error. And at that time, when Boeing was really rooting for this model, it almost seemed like Boeing was going to be bankrupt because the plane had crashed. They had developed it for 10 years and it had crashed. And what Boeing did, interestingly, of course, the military also, Boeing and military got together. It was for the US military. And Boeing and military got together and they said, hey, plane mein to kuch gadbad nahi hai. There's nothing wrong with the piece of machine. Something else happened here, right? And therefore, they still ordered 5 planes and they conducted checks and tests and simulations. And what they realized is what was missing was a checklist, right? What happened that day was that it was a new piece of machine. It was new. The whole model was new. And one small critical step of unlocking the elevator and rudder controls was missed by the pilot. That's it. That's all that happened. And therefore, the answer was a checklist. And after that, it was a 6-point checklist. It was nothing complicated. It was a sheet of paper, an index card. It was a small index card, just this much, which could be put onto the cockpit, and which is something the pilot needed to check before he made the flight airborne. That's it, right? And after that checklist, they had that model 299. It was infamous, jaise bol lo. That model flew 1.8 million miles without an accident. So it's simple. It's so simple, like I'm saying, and I'm repeating. It's so simple that it almost sounds stupid. But I think it is so useful if we were to start thinking about business contexts. Right, could save us a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of heartburn, a lot of energy. Because हम repeated mistakes को correct करने में बहुत समय spend करते हैं. And that's probably something that this can help us do. Second case study. In 2012, WHO, the World Health Organization, they led a project to reduce the infection and mortality rate in surgery across the world, right? And they have been noticing, of course, WHO is a pivotal health organization, and their statistics and data showed them that across the world, दुनिया के हर कोने में, चाहे वो कनाडा हो, चाहे वो यूएस हो, चाहे वो इंडिया हो, not only developing nations but also developed nations had a huge problem of increased infection and death in surgery. And why was this happening? Because the surgical rates had gone up. अब हर चीज के लिए सर्जरी होती थी. There are about 6,000 or I think 7,000. The number is mind-boggling. 7,000 kinds of surgery that hospitals undertake. And this has been steadily growing over the years. And what is interesting is that even expertise is growing. That is the kind of specialization that the medical field is going to. And yet, despite all those specializations and all that increase in expertise and training, what WHO figured out कि यार अस्पतालों में तो अभी भी infection rate और post-surgery infection rates and post-surgery deaths is really, really high. And how do we bring this down? So they led a study with a team of doctors from the US and across the world. And again, interestingly, what was the solution? The solution was a checklist, right? A surgical checklist was introduced in all the pilot hospitals that WHO was working on that project. It's a simple, and I'll show that checklist to you. It's a simple checklist. Nothing fancy, nothing rocket science. And the results were absolutely magical. The results were so good that they just couldn't believe it. Across all the countries, it was not कि developed nations में यार results बहुत अच्छे आ गए. US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, everywhere, the project reduced infection rate by 35%, and very, very interestingly, it reduced the death rate by 47%. Just a simple checklist. So therefore, the conclusion that WHO, sort of came up with, they said, checklists were better than a new drug. Because everybody in the medical field is looking for a new drug. They're looking for that panacea, that something that will solve our problems. And they figured out that a checklist had reduced death by 47% in all of these hospitals at least. And that was magical. And when I was reading about it, and I said, अगर इतने कॉम्प्लेक्स एनवायरनमेंट्स में, इतने फास्ट चेंजिंग एनवायरनमेंट्स में, इतने हाई रिस्क एनवायरनमेंट्स में चेकलिस्ट जादू कर सकती है, तो क्या हमारे बिजनेसेस में नहीं कर सकती? इंटरेस्टिंगली, उन्नति हैड चेकलिस्ट्स. Right? Very interesting. We have a facilitation checklist. For example, when you go before a session, we have a checklist. But I haven't seen that enough in the MSME sector. मैंने checklist को use होते हुए नहीं देखा है. Checklists are not to-do lists. If checklists can be used in such complex environments, and I think businesses are becoming more and more complex each day. So I can't say businesses are as complex. Maybe they're not. They are complex, but probably the cost of failure is not as high. Let me put it this way. But they are complex, and they're getting more and more complex. And second, I think the challenge that we have faced is कि process लगते नहीं है. Process को लगाने में, process को follow through करने में, पहले तो बनाने में ही इतना time लगता है. That is there an intermediate step? Is there something that we can start with and get some results fast? And maybe the checklist is an answer. Because what typically happens, and what happens is that दो चीज का failure होता है. Right, in this puzzle of why do experts or why do people who know how to do their jobs? See, we are not talking about people who don't know how to do their jobs. In either the aviation industry or the pharmaceutical industry, we are not talking about people जिनको अपना काम नहीं आता. This is probably the pinnacle of expertise. Right? They are people who really know their job very well. They study for I don't know how many years. They fly for how many hours before they get to be in a cockpit, right? Or in a surgery, in a room, in an operating theater. But it's not the failure of knowledge. It's not कि मुझे आता नहीं है कैसे करना है. It is the failure of ineptitude, जिसको philosophers ineptitude बोलते हैं, which is simply put is just failing to apply the knowledge correctly when it's required, right? And the reasons are many. It's not because मुझे आता नहीं है. It's because sometimes the details are mind numbing. Sometimes हमें इतनी आदत हो जाती है उसकी कि हम करते ही नहीं, उसको हम भूल जाते हैं. It's easy to skip, right? It's easy to ignore. And therefore, what checklists are trying to do is just plug this failure. कि मुझे आता है, I know how to do it, I've done it a zillion times, but yet doing it again in the right way is what checklists can help. How do we do this, right? So I think this is something that we always say at Unnati ki ज्ञान बोझ है, इसको उतारेंगे कैसे जीवन में. You can use it, like I said, in sales, you can use it in operations. Sales में NBD meeting में जाते हैं sales वाले, और मैं experienced sales वालों की बात कर रही हूँ. I'm not talking about freshers, and I think that's the point I want to make, that it's not about experience. It's just that because we have been doing it so many times, a lot of times we miss the very, very fundamental critical steps, right? And maybe it's the expertise that is making us do it, because expert हो जाते हो तो थोड़ी सी humility कम हो जाती है, थोड़ी arrogance बढ़ जाती है, right? और मैंने ये देखा है कि ये experience लोग ज़्यादा करते हैं. So it's not intentional, but it's just that, oh, I know it. I mean, I've done it a zillion times, right? Come on, what, you're asking me to do a stupid checklist, right? And I think that's the magic. Sales, and I was talking about sales and NBD positions. NBD के लिए आप client के साथ जा रहे हो, there has to be 5 things that you must know or you must talk about with the client. But how many meetings the critical things are missed, right? जिसके बारे में बात करनी है client के बारे में, वो तो हम बात ही नहीं करते हैं. कुछ और कहानी वो सुनाता है, कुछ और कहानी हम सुनते हैं, and we come back thinking it was a great meeting, but it wasn't. You didn't ask the 5 questions that needed to be asked, right? And I think that's where checklists can actually bring so much magic and simplicity. I think the magic is in simplicity. In MSME, it's not about the cost of failure as much, but I think it's the heartburn. It's the amount of time we waste. It's the amount of money we waste. It's the amount of human resource we waste on problems that could be just plugged, right? It could just be done when you're doing it rather than discovering later and then figuring out isko kaise settle karna hai. And these are problems that we repeatedly do. I think I just want to underline that point. Please plug your repeated leaks. We are not trying to solve for one-off problems. We are trying to solve with checklists. यार जो problems रोज करते हैं, रोज जो हम जिस challenge को face करते हैं, चाहे वो operations में हो, manufacturing में हो, machine की maintenance में हो, चाहे वो finance में हो, चाहे वो sales में हो, चाहे वो HR में हो, कौन से holes हैं जो रोज leak करते हैं. And I think Biren bhai, nothing against standard operating procedures, but again they sound very complicated. SOPs sound very complicated, and in most cases are complicated to make. Not complicated, they need a certain kind of commitment, they need a certain kind of experience, they are daunting. मुझे हिंदी का शब्द नहीं आता उसके लिए, but वो एक पहाड़ है जिसको देख के आपको लगता है यार उसको चढ़ूं कैसे मैं, right? And that is what I think probably the checklist is not. And I think that's what I want to seriously really emphasize on. That because I think we see people struggling with this thing, and I think this is one probably solution we can adopt very simply, very easily, and get results and get phenomenal results. If hospitals can do it, cockpits can do it, I don't see why our businesses can't. It's okay to make a checklist. It's not about incapability, right? So what do checklists do? Because I think most of the time when we find a mistake or we find an error, what do we throw at it? We try to increase our expertise, या हम training, हम सोचते हैं कि यार इसको ना ट्रेनिंग बढ़ाते हैं, इसकी ट्रेनिंग से ये ठीक हो जाएगा, या एक्सपर्टीज बढ़ाने की कोशिश करते हैं. But I don't think all the time that is the answer. I think most of the time the answer is as simple as a checklist. And I did that, and it's amazing. It just took away the tension, the frustration. Before you open the door, there is a checklist there, take it, right? And it's as simple as that. But it was difficult to do. Honestly, it was difficult for me to do. And maybe that's where is one of the mindset issues of checklists. So how can they help? I think we have talked about it. 2 things very, 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 very quickly. They can help in the critical memory recall. बहुत सारी चीजें हबड़ दबड़ में, बहुत सारे काम में, complexity में, rush में, need to do things fast में, memory fails us. And that's what checklists help with. They help with memory recall. The second thing they help with is minimum necessary steps. ये 5 चीजें तो होनी ही है. Like hiring की checklist में I was talking about. ये 5 चीजें पूछनी है बेटा, और कुछ पूछ ना पूछ. ये 5 चीजें पे मेरे को टिक चाहिए. I want to know this has been checked, right? So minimum necessary steps. And when you do that, I think interestingly what happens with checklists is that you raise the minimum performance baseline level. Minimum performance baseline level का standard आप raise कर देते हैं. And that's what is interesting. So these are the two reasons why checklists can really help. Where do checklists help more? So there are 3 kinds. If I unlock this whole world of tasks and problems, there are 3 kinds of tasks, problems. Simple, the complicated, and complex. Simple is, for example, baking a cake, right? You have a recipe, you have 6 steps, you bake a cake. You have an oven, hopefully, and you bake a cake. Complicated is launching a rocket, right? It has too many moving parts. It has multiple teams. It has multiple expertise. It has multiple variables. It has a high cost of risk. Those are complicated situations. But both a cake and a rocket, once you establish a process, right, you can repeatedly do it. आप repeatedly उसको कर सकते हैं, right? Of course, if you change whether you want to fly a rocket to Mars or moons, things will change. But mota 60% you are there, right? Complicated task is complex in itself, but it's repeatable. The very complex tasks are repeatable, but they cannot be repeated in the same way. For example, bringing up a child. If you have 2 children, people who have 2 or 3 children will know that bringing up one was not equal to bringing up the other, right? Because children and people are complex, they are different. And therefore, complex tasks need more than task checklists. They need communication checklists. And I'm not going to cover that in this session, but I'm talking just about the simple and complicated tasks. They can be easily dealt with checklists. So for simple and complicated tasks, you can use a checklist. A checklist is an excellent way to get things right. What kind of checklists? I'll come to that before I come to this. So there are 2 kinds of checklists. There is a read-do checklist. For example, a recipe is a read-do checklist, right? Anything which is repeatable, which has to be done by not experts, right? Down the line जो tasks हैं जो repeatable हैं, they can be read and do. मतलब आप करें, ये steps हैं, और जहाँ पे भी sequence important है, right? जहाँ पे भी इसके बाद ये करना important है, right? अब अगर केक बनाना है तो यार अंडे एक पॉइंट पे ऐड करने हैं. जिन्होंने भी केक बनाया है उनको पता होगा. You can't do it any which way. You have to do it in a sequence. So in those simple tasks where it's not very expertise driven, a read-do checklist works. In other places where it's a complicated task, right? It's a complicated task, which means you cannot predict the sequence. For example, if you're going for a customer meeting, you can't predict the sequence. If I'm talking to a candidate, you can't predict what he will say, what I will say, what kind of conversation we'll have. And in those cases, you have to have what is called a do confirm, right? तो आप अपना काम कर लें, but काम खत्म करने से पहले, next step पे जाने से पहले एक चेकलिस्ट देख लें कि आपने बहुत कुछ किया, but 5 critical चीजें की नहीं की. Did you check these 5 boxes? Am I making sense? Just give me a show of hands, right? So there are 2 kinds of checklists: read, do, and do confirm, right? I think the do confirm checklists are very interesting in our operations, in our sales, in our hiring. These are complicated situations, but even in those situations, you have a minimum necessary that is required. यार ये 5-4 चीजें तो होनी है. If I go back to what makes a good checklist, because I've seen some horrible ones, it has to be precise and to the point, right? Easy to use, which means it should fit in half a page. So that's the target for a good checklist. Checklist बनानी है लंबी चौड़ी पेज, पन्ने नहीं भरने हैं. And I think a lot of us have this problem with prioritization, right? When we want to make a checklist, हमें सब कुछ डालना है उसमें, नहीं, सब कुछ नहीं डालना. Some things you know will get done, but there are some things which maybe you know will get done, will not get done, but they're extremely critical. So you want to be sure that they get done, right? It's as simple as that. So just 6 or 7 things on half a piece of paper is your checklist. And most important, most critical stuff. This is the guideline for a good, usable checklist. And when you try to implement it in your businesses. Make sure that the next step needs the checklist, right? So for example, when Barkha comes to us, the HR person in Gupani, saying that I want to set up an interview, she has to bring a checklist, right? कि इसके बिना यार interview setup नहीं होगा. So that is one thing that you have to make sure, because implementation के challenges तो वहीं खड़े हैं. बनाना थोड़ा सिंपल है, चेकलिस्ट को, प्रोसेस है, एसओपी को कंपेयर करूं मैं, बट इम्प्लीमेंटेशन के चैलेंजेस थोड़े इजी इसी में है, बिकॉज इट्स इजियर टू यूज, राइट? सो इफ आई हैव अ हाफ पेज चेकलिस्ट, इज इजियर टू यूज. ऑफ कोर्स द माइंडसेट इशू विद एक्सपर्ट्स विल बी देयर. तो अगर आपने एक्सपीरियंस्ड सेल्स वाले को बोलोगे चेकलिस्ट भरने के लिए, या एक्सपीरियंस्ड अकाउंटेंट को बोलोगे कि यार ये चेकलिस्ट भरना जीएसटी की, you will have some challenges of mindset there, but it can be overcome. It's worth, I think, pushing the checklist in your businesses. So I think in summary, I can very safely say checklist cannot fly a plane, but it can certainly prevent it from crashing, right? And I think that's what it can do with our businesses. It cannot handle all the complexity of your business, but it can help us plug the repeated leaks. And I'm, I think, stressing on this. I see this day in and day out. We repeat our mistakes, and some of them are extremely costly, extremely painful, extremely time consuming, because हर जगह तो ओनर को लगना पड़ता है, right? And it takes you out from your high value tasks and puts you in your low value task zone. So identify those 10 places where you're really bleeding and leaking, and try a checklist.